It's funny, actually, there's nothing quite more terrifying than talking in front of a group of your peers. I think if I was in southern Queensland, I'd feel okay about this. Jordan and I were asked to come and speak about what we do on our place and tell a little bit of our story. I guess to put it in perspective, it's just some things we'd like to present. It's maybe not a topic that I'm super comfortable with, and I figure that's because I just don't actually know as much about it as I want yet. But I got the rest of my grazing career to come up with some more answers, so touch base in 20 to 30 years. Um, let's talk about 2014. The story of Amelia Downs and the story of my family on Amelia Downs probably starts well before then, but I thought it may be a good date to pick in the calendar. We were both working on the biggest projects of our career to date, and we hadn't actually met. Jordan was heading up a government project we now know as MyGov, trying to sort out multiple stakeholders for the many silos of government, for anyone that's ever worked in government, to come to the party about a centralised system of Medicare. And I'd just taken over management of my family's very drought-stricken cattle station. It was a year where one of the most senior members of the local grazing community gave me a very hard to hear piece of unsolicited advice. He told me I didn't have a grass problem, I had a management problem. And understandably, at 20 something years of age, I was somewhat offended. What do you mean? So there's nothing quite as motivational for me to get better at what I'm doing than being told I made a fundamental error. For those of you who know me well, like most graziers, being told it cannot be done as an invitation to find a way. Which was lucky because in 2015 we got 73 mils of rain and I had to find a way to keep us in business. I think everyone here would remember that drought, but it was my first drought and we could have looked at it in two ways. It was a threat to our business or an opportunity. And it's really just a matter of perspective. We're destocked for the third time in 3 years, and we chose to see what could have been seen as a disaster to have a reset and have a rest. I mean, we were running 300 cows on 50,000 acres in a good rotational program. I measured the grass, I assessed the animal performance, I gave them all names. It was grand. And I learned a little bit about the things that were really important to me as a business person and me as a grazier. The things like animal welfare, maintaining ground cover. I guess drawing a line in the sand about where I felt I wanted to be between environment, sustainability, and profitability. I think it's probably a pretty important moment to introduce noise in our industry. A lot of us, particularly young producers and old producers, we're wanting to grow and change. The ideas, the standards that are being set are growing and changing. And yet if you sit on a fence at a camp draft or a cattle sale, you always hear what's going to happen next. It can become so distracting, some of these noises, that you'll begin to make decisions based on them. And we've all heard them, things like we'll never be able to afford to buy back in. The government's going to shut us down, which they have once, admittedly. Cattle aren't worth enough to sell, but you can't afford to buy them later on either. And my personal favourite, I have no choice but to eat on my grass. And I do understand there's been people in that situation. And it was probably that single thing, that I had no choice, made me want to make sure that we always had choices. So I'll be back on track now. Sorry. About these two strangers from different industries at the end of 2014 have ended up running a grazing business together 8 years later. 2016 to 2018 was some of the most amazing years yet of my career. And I like to think of it as a career, but I chose to be in grazing. I want to be out there in the paddock and swing off the end of a set of pliers or chase cows around, obviously not right now. And I learned to build things like cash flow, stock flow, and grass flow. It was a year to get some runs on the board for my family and for myself. And I had some really good first attempts at learning. I learned how to buy trade cattle and sell them again. I learned that the conception rate on a 9-year-old Brahman cow in store condition purchased from somewhere north of Croydon can be anywhere of up to 80%. And when they start calving, they put a big hole in your grass budget. I learned that if you put 1,600 head in a mob of cattle in a rotation and start moving them about with a few dogs and one other ringer, you best get your temper, your stock handling skills, and your humility in order, because you're going to learn a thing or two. And yet, I still feel that we have so many things to learn. At the time, 2018, I'd got very limited in what I perceived was the nutrition profile of our country in North Queensland. We have a wet, we have a growing season, we get a frost, and our cattle go backwards. And I built our business around those things. I built our supplemented program around that. I built our sales schedules around that. And I probably got comfortable in that place. I felt that I couldn't afford to spend any more money on infrastructure. And to be honest, I just wasn't really keen on putting in lots of fence at the time. So complacent is probably where we were. You know, market wasn't too bad. We had some feed, we had some cattle, we had a bit of cash. It was all good. And then I was minding my own business at the local pool in Townsville, and I swam into this guy. I think the part of that was sometimes you just need a little bit of outside perspective. So where we are now, and what's shaped the business we run?
So yeah, so who are we, and what shaped the business that we run together? So we started Riverseed together in 2019 out at Amelia Downs. So we took over management and running of the place from Jane's parents. There was a lot of things that were already in place. There was really strong infrastructure. There was good water. There were really good operating systems. So we're off to a really sort of strong start. So we looked at each other and sort of said, okay, so how do we make this ours, and how do we set our own goals? We sat down and we sort of thought about, well, what's important to us? Obviously, we want to run a profitable business. We want to be able to eat. That's handy. You know, a sustainable business that's there for the long term is really important to us. And we do care about things like animal welfare as well. So we thought, okay, if those things are important to us, and there's already a lot of sort of things that you might sort of look to do had already been done in terms of developing the place, well, what could we do? What could we bring to the party? So for me, I sort of coming not off the land and from town, I had no preconceived ideas. I didn't know what I was doing. Didn't know what I was doing wrong. Still don't sometimes, but it meant that, you know, sort of everything I kind of asked, well, why do we do that? And something for me was we made a lot of decisions out of our gut feelings, and sometimes we kind of, you know, you always want the grass to look a little bit greener, and sometimes you sort of got those green covered glasses on, and you come back and you think, oh yeah, Jane, I think there was still a bit of green in the base. There was, you know, and you kind of, well, maybe it was just the tint on the Land Cruiser when you're driving around. But I sort of thought, okay, so sometimes we'd be sitting there on the couch and we might get a call from the cattle agent, and he'd say, look, we just had a bit of a spot open up. Do you reckon that you could put a couple of decks of heifers together tomorrow for an order that's just come in? And we sort of went, maybe, I think so, but I'm not sure. And we'd probably have to go out tomorrow and you know, drag those heifers back to the yards and put them through the draft to make that decision on whether we could fill that order. And that's not good for our cattle. That's not good for the productivity of the cattle. It's not good for us in terms of our time. And so we sort of thought, okay, well, how can we actually make that decision from sitting on the couch at 9 o'clock at night and be able to say, yeah, we can actually do that. We can fill that. We've got that spec and we can do it now. So I sort of thought maybe there's a few ways that we can measure things a little bit different. Doesn't mean that your gut's wrong, but maybe we can get a bit better with our data. Staffing. So Jane and her parents have been running the show and been running a really good show. When her parents sort of moved south to Kyogle, that left a bit of a hole. She had this newbie here that was pretty useless, couldn't strain a fence or do anything. And so we sort of thought, okay, well, what's that mean for our staffing profile? And we're pretty ambitious and we want to grow, but you're only limited by 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week. So if you do want to grow and you want to expand, well, you kind of need to bring staff along with the journey. We run a rotational grazing enterprise, we run a trading enterprise. And when that goes well, that goes really well. And when that goes bad, that can go pear-shaped really quickly. When you have a water problem and you've got 1,600 head all looking for a drink, things get pretty exciting. So we sort of thought, righto, well, we'd like to bring some staff on board, and backpackers are cheap and handy, but we actually want to give young people sort of an opportunity in the industry as well. Jane's very passionate about bringing young people into the bush and giving girls an opportunity that they might not otherwise have. So how can we carve out an environment where staff feel part of the team, where they feel valued, where they want to work there and they want to hopefully come back for a second season. And for us also, it was one of those things where, it's important to us to, it's not just about checking waters. We're looking at what's our animal behavior like, what's the grass looking like, what's the dung looking like today. And if we're not out doing that water run, but our staff are, we're not seeing all those things. And so we need our staff to understand and be part of that process so that when they're going out there, and Brooke, who's sitting here in the second row, became very well versed in it, that, she'd come back to us and she'd come back with a million pictures, and we've got so many pictures on our phone of poo and, grass and all that kind of stuff. But, to actually play back that narrative of, no, it wasn't just that there was water in the tank, but here's what's happening in the paddock. Because for us to run that type of operation, we need to have our fingers on the pulse and know that at all times. So for us, it was sort of like, we can probably get better at the data, but we also need to bring some staff along for the journey and make them a really valuable part of our enterprise as well.
And this ties into probably this discussion about noise. So we have broken our business down into what is it that helps us make decisions. And obviously we make decisions around grass, we make decisions around stock, and we make decisions around money. The things that we think about when we're doing that is what we can control, and what in those areas of control can we then use to manage the areas that you can't necessarily control, but you damn well can influence. And then what's outside your area of control, of your area of influence. And they're normally the things you hear about at the pub or the sale yard or the camp draft, and they're variables outside our sphere of control. Things like interest rates, things like the cattle market, things like rainfall. We can't control those things, but we can control how we manage our country, how we manage our cattle, so that we're in the best position to take an opportunity when those things change. I think it's really easy to waste energy on them. We've all spent a full night completely awake worrying about something we can't do anything about. But even just knowing that you can't do anything about it sometimes helps you sleep. It's back to that taking off the green tinted glasses and being really realistic about what we can affect and what actually affects us. So just want to touch base on some nitty gritty. I promise there is not a spreadsheet in this talk, and anyone that knows me, I love my spreadsheets. So what can we control? For me in grass, and I'm happy for the audience to tell me I'm wrong or come up with some of their own, but it's things like stocking rate. Days your country gets under spell, not just in one block, but days your country gets under spell in a year. Ground cover. I truly believe we can control that. And residual plant matter through the other three. With our cattle, I think we can control mob size. I think we can control herd density. Through trading cattle of a lot of brands in the north, I believe that we can control the handle that we have on cattle. Maybe not when they come off the truck, but over time. And that has become core and fundamental to our business because none of us like to get hurt. We work with a lot of young people. And I actually just genuinely enjoy it. It's an area that I've found of passion. I like taking cattle that maybe don't agree with me and getting them to agree with me. The other thing that we can control through data is what we know about our herd. And that comes back to that having systems in place to be able to keep really good records. Not just about how many are in your paddock, but what's in your paddock. Bringing it and tying it all back into being able to take opportunities when they present themselves. What do these things influence? In grass for us, in terms of a rotational grazing environment, we truly believe that we can influence the quality of our feed. We feel that we can influence the quantity of our feed, the response to rainfall, and our moisture attainment. In our cattle, I've written reconnection, but it's actually reconception rate. We have a level of control over that through nutrition. We have a level of control over our herd fertility through culling and genetics. We have an enormous amount of control over our supplement cost if we're prepared to work at it. And something more recently we've discovered is we have huge control over the curfew of our cattle going to sale. Now that mightn't seem particularly relevant, but there's a damn lot of difference between a 1.5% curfew and a 6% curfew on a bullock that goes into town. And we've actually discovered that under the right conditions, we can affect that, and it then affects our bottom line. Sorry, I'm really nervous. This is something a bit different to talk about. I think if we start with the grass that we've grown and work towards the grass we want to grow, then we can build a business plan around that. We're pretty darn lucky here in the north in one way that we can nearly guarantee that we're going to get some kind of rainfall event between January and April. And then after April, we can pretty much guarantee that if we get a rainfall event, it's more of an oddity than a regularity. And so you can look at what you've had at the end of April, make some assumptions about how much feed you're going to have till the following February and run with that. There's very few other climates in Australia that you can work on that with. Once you start to go into southern Queensland, you're working on winter seasons and summer seasons and an oats crop, and there's up here what you grow is what you grow. That's what you've got to play with, and provided it doesn't burn, you can make some decisions around that. So what we've started to find is that as we get more control over the grazing and the resting of our country, that grass is a pretty cool thing. You can graze it, you can rest it and get some rain and it grows back. Money doesn't grow on trees, but for our businesses, that's really relevant. And we try and use that to make good decisions. We try and use it to take advantages of opportunities. And I think my brief here today was to talk about when to graze it and when to save it. Now, I can't answer that question, but I know that we can get tools to answer that question for ourselves in our individual businesses if we just put a bit of work in. So what if we start thinking about our grass as a monetary base? We start to think of it the same way we think about our cattle as an asset, or our banking account as an overdraft or an asset. Is there anyone in the audience here who could tell me how many tonnes per hectare they yielded off their feed last year? Do you think if I was sitting in a room full of grain farmers here today, that someone would be able to answer me that question? They also grow grass. It's a different kind of grass, but the theory is the same. So imagine if you knew how many tonnes per hectare you were yielding. If there was some calculations out there that might be able to help you out there, you'd then be able to identify where you're doing well in country, maybe where you're overutilising country, and maybe where you could do better. And that's the kind of data that I've been lucky enough to inherit. My mum was an amazing record keeper, and she basically handed me the keys to this Ferrari. Here's what this place has done for the last 10 years on these rainfalls. You go and see what you can do with it. And so we have, and I guess that's where we start to think about, if we have this much in the paddock and we've had this much rain, we historically know that we probably do X, Y, Z with this. And I said I wouldn't get into the maths, but the process of working it out is relatively simple, and there are so many tools out there. You've just heard about one. There's so many tools out there to be able to do that. And so obviously for us, pasture budgeting is probably very similar to a grain farmer knowing what yield he's going to get off his crop and what his inputs are and what his fertilizer cost will be and what his moisture profile has to be to regrow a crop. Maybe it's something we should start to think about. So for us, from a business perspective, there are three pieces to our puzzle. There's a stock flow, there's a cash flow, and there's a grass flow. And where do you think we start in a year when we're planning? It's with the grass flow, because it's the finite thing in our business. Whatever we get, we get. You know, we can alter our cattle numbers, we can talk to our bank, but what we've got in the paddock is what we've got in the paddock, and then that gets really cool, because then you can just decide how you're going to eat it. For us, we do all this with a focus to our country. We want to improve the quality of our feed for the following year. So you begin with the end in mind. And I think the way that I would explain that is, when we think about our country, we think about what do we want it to look like when we get to the next rainfall event. Almost this idea of rain ready, if anyone will come with me on that one. If we can start where we want our country to be rain ready, whether that be a residual grass base, or whether we want our feed to be in different stages of growth and different stages of grazing, so that if we get a year like this year, where we had some country that was rain ready in April, you know, we could get a response off whatever moisture event that we got because we'd left enough in the paddock to do something with that. And that's really exciting stuff. That's like getting into that Ferrari and being able to drive that system a little bit faster. Hopefully we don't hit a roo. So when do we graze it and when do we save it? For me, flexibility equals risk mitigation. And every business and every business person is different. We have different risk thresholds. We have different times a year that we want to operate, and we've got different goals in our business. For us, we don't always want to have the same class of cattle. Our part of the world and everyone's country is different, but it doesn't enjoy wet cows in September, and neither do I. I don't like feeding molasses. I'm a bit of a sook like that. It's hard work. And so we make some decisions around that. People want weaners of different weight and want turn-off of different weight. We just don't want all our eggs in one basket. We've come to realise that through rotational grazing, we actually have some flexibility in how we plan and how we set up our paddocks and how we plan our inventory, because we always know what's in the lead of us. If I was to sort of flesh that out a bit, we know through our data that our country sits at around 22% protein through the summer months. We've got some good data on some weight gain, but we've also got some really fantastic data that says that come September and a heavy frost, we're sitting at 1% protein, and that's not going to sustain any animal, no matter its condition, wet or dry, without supplement. So you can make some really early decisions about costs. So let's put some numbers behind what we see in the paddock. Jordan spoke to you earlier about his ability to use data and information to refine our decisions. And I really just wanted to talk about that and draw some conclusions into the bottom lines on your businesses and why grass is so important to that. We've been able to use the data that we have to work out the value of a day of grass to each of the different classes of our cattle, whether it be a bullock, a steer, a wet cow, a pregnant cow, at different times of the year. We all know that the value of a day of grass to a bullock in May is pretty important, but the value of a day of good feed to a wet cow in November is critical. And so when we're making decisions about who we sell that feed to, we've got to look at the things that drive our business, what our focus is, what are the things that we want to achieve, and how much feed we've got to do it. And so, like I said, there's no magic bullet, and every business is different. But just by knowing that we can put a dollar figure on our grass, and to throw an arbitrary number out there, the easiest way to say that is, well, what could I sell it to someone else for? If I didn't put my animal on this feed today, but I acknowledge that there was feed here, what would someone pay me to use that feed for their animal? Can I make more out of the animal that I own on that grass, or can I not? And if you know a little bit about your weight gain, that becomes pretty easy to answer. Part of something that we've started to do, and we've commenced a trial with DAF, is we've started weighing our cattle in the paddock. We use an OptiWeigh. We rotate them really regularly, and part of the driver behind that is we wanted to know the answer to, is what I'm doing to my cattle, and I'm that cow botherer that someone mentioned earlier. I like to shift cows. It's fun. Sometimes Brooke and I move them every week, and I wanted to know if that was affecting the production of my business. Was this need to try and put my pasture first all the time affecting the production of the business? The funny thing about data is when you start to look for something, you start to see some other things. So we had 2 fairly significant rain events in the last 2 months. I imagine most of the people in this room would have. Our cattle went backwards by 2.1 kilos per day for every day of rain that we received in April and every day of rain that we received in May. And they stood still and didn't put weight on for the following 10 days in both of those events. Now, do you think that's powerful to your business when you're making decisions in management? Because it was to me. That's the difference between an animal hitting a grid and not. What if I took it one step further? So we've got cows calving in November, December, January, February, whenever they fall. Does my wet 350 kilo weaner mum have 20 kilos to lose if she gets 10 wet days in a row and still stay alive and feed that calf? And I think that becomes powerful in how much feed you're prepared to leave in the paddock and what you need to leave in the paddock for that animal. So while we don't know that, we know it doesn't ring good grass and all those things, I think that that single piece, if I get nothing out of this data trial, actually having some quantitative, I always knew that they looked a bit, hollow, but I didn't know that. I always knew that my cattle did about 110 kilos a year or 0.3 a day. But I've since discovered they do 150 kilos a year and lose 30 or 40 or 50. And that becomes important. And then we start to ask questions, well, why, or what could we do differently to get a different outcome? And I want to talk about making decisions about grazing stuff from a land asset point of view. Because we run our operations, we own a land business, we've got a cattle business, and we've got a lifestyle. So can you quantify the value of new infrastructure through the application of grazing management and increased yield? Can you? Put your hands up. Would you be able to do that sum? Is there anyone here that could do that sum? Or is even interested in knowing what the value of a fence line is to you? So and I'm happy not to, but I thought I'd have a crack at this one. John and I have put in 60 Ks of fence in the last 3 years. And it's not because I love fencing. Like any good piece of business management, there needed to be some numbers around that. We actually needed to justify the cost and the labour and the toll on our staff because it is hard work. And so being an avid record keeper, as I have been over the last 10 years and the 10 years before that, I know that some paddocks on our place we yield over 1,000 kilos per hectare of utilised feed per year. And in some paddocks, we'd be flat out getting 160. So if I know that a cow needs 3,650 kilos of feed a year to sustain her, and there's a lot of science behind that, and I didn't do it, so that's grand. And we know that they improve their body weight by 110 kilos a year in our part of the country and the 20 that they lose. You can actually start to say, well, if I put a fence down there and I can shift that paddock from 160 kilos a year to 320 or 340 kilos a year, what's that worth in actual kilos on my animals? And you can work a payback period pretty quickly through that. And that's where we start to put some numbers around what is the value of our grass to us. I don't have massive amounts to add to that, but I'd be happy to take or bounce some ideas. I think that I've learned as much off my peers as I have off consultants, and I have off the older generation. I think that we have a great opportunity in some of the technology that's out there, but we have a great opportunity in talking to people and looking over the fence and going, well, why is that like that and why is this like this? And how do we make it better?